My name is Alina Rivera. I'm 32, and this is the story of how a single envelope on my birthday nearly burned my family down, until a voiceover at a corporate awards night changed the map of my life. If you enjoy real-life stories like mine, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. I grew up in a neat brick house on the edge of a Boston suburb, where lawns were measured by how straight the hedges were, and Sunday dinners meant someone would inevitably ask when I was going to settle down. My father, Mark, worked at a mid-sized manufacturing firm. Practical, punctual, the kind of man who made lists and stuck to them. My mother, Rosa, taught middle school English and loved brittle, old paperbacks. I was their eldest child, the one who took a job in the city and called every Sunday out of habit rather than obligation. The year I turned 32, things were a slow-burning, familiar ache. I had worked my way through a string of jobs, assistant, coordinator, junior manager, until I landed a role in a health tech startup. It wasn't glamorous. It was a place where people wore hoodies and argued about user interfaces, but the work mattered. I managed partnerships, hospitals, clinics, insurance contacts. I liked the rhythm of it. I liked that the emails at 3 in the morning were a small price for seeing patients helped by our pilot program. More than anything, I liked that I was finally feeling like I could steer my own career, not because of a sudden windfall, but because the little decisions I made actually started to add up. At home, the undercurrent was different. My parents had a comfortable generosity. They had never been extravagant, but they had an air of certainty about what success looked like. For them, success meant a stable job, a house with a paid-off mortgage, a clear path. When I told them about taking more risks, about stock options and startups, their faces would fold into thin, careful smiles. "Steady is safe," my father would say, as if repeating a prayer. The morning of my birthday, the house smelled like coffee and buttered toast. My mother had set up a small cake with too few candles, and my brother Mateo, who still lived at home, was loud and affectionate in a way that made our cat bolt. I had learned to accept small celebrations. They were more ritual than surprise, comforting in their predictability. I opened cards. I laughed. My father handed me a plain, thick envelope. He said, "We thought this would be appropriate. Read it when you have time." There was a protective look in his eyes that I misread at first as the same careful concern he always wore. I slid my thumb under the flap and felt the weight of paper, not recessed cash, not a stock certificate, but the particular feel of official stationery. The phrase, "for your consideration," would have been more merciful than what it actually said when I unfolded it. It was a typed letter. It read, in formal tones that belonged in a legal office rather than at my kitchen table, that as of that day my father intended to cut me off financially. The reasons were couched politely. Unsuitable career choices, unwillingness to adhere to family expectations, the need for fiscal responsibility in the household. There was a line about disownment papers that felt impossibly theatrical until I realized it was a phrase my father had actually used, as if he had rehearsed a courtroom monologue. I remember the way the cake blurred into yellow. The house hummed with normal family noise, the clatter of plates, Mateo's off-key singing, and I held the letter with a strange, cold concentration, as if the paper itself contained some new gravity. My mother's face shifted. She murmured something and reached for my hand, but my father withdrew as if the letter had been a lit match and he was watching to see how it burned. "I don't want to argue on your birthday," he said, in the same practical voice that had taught me to wash the dishes after dinner. "But you need to understand where we're coming from. We've helped you for years. This isn't about love, it's about boundaries." Boundaries? The word felt small and brittle. I thought about the college tuition they'd covered, the years they let me come home between jobs and allowed me to sleep in the old room upstairs. I thought about every "will help if you need it" that had stacked like a safety net under my life. And I thought about the moment when that net started to feel suffocating rather than supportive. We argued, though it wasn't the kind of shouting match you see in movies. It was surgical, precise phrases, clean sentences, each one landing like a small, purposeful incision. My father spoke of expectations unfulfilled. My mother finally said quietly, "We just want you to stop making choices we think will hurt you." Mateo tried to be a peacemaker, saying I should compromise a little, as if who I was could be sanded down to suit the family furniture. When I left that afternoon, the sky was a wan, thin blue. I didn't take the letter. I left it on the kitchen table, as if some object could contain the rupture and my distance could let it heal itself. I told myself I would call that night. I imagined apologies, soft returns to normalcy, the odd awkwardness easing into routine. I told myself all the things people tell themselves when the ground tilts under their feet. That night changed everything. I walked the city streets, letting the crowd be a different kind of noise. I called a friend, Myra, who lived in a studio littered with plants and second-hand books. "They gave me disownment papers," I said, and she was quiet for a second before she started to laugh in the exact way people do when they don't know whether to be horrified or amused. "Only you would get disownment papers on your birthday," she said. "Only you." We made tea and talked until the sugar bowl looked empty. She reminded me about the times I'd swallowed my pride to take a position I didn't like, the 4 years I'd tolerated a commute from hell because it meant learning something new. "You're allowed to want different things," she said, with the easy conviction of someone who believed in the justice of small comforts. Her words were not a balm for how the letter felt, but they were a reminder that my life was not only what my father's paper declared it to be. I didn't go home that night. I slept on a futon and woke up to a string of missed calls. My mother left a voice message that said, "Call us," in the kind of voice that held onto words like a lifeline. My father texted a photo of the kitchen as if to say, "The house looks the same. Why can't you see that?" The next days were a study in a slow, familiar grief. The ways family conflicts wrap around the ordinary, dinners that feel like interrogations, holidays that taste of reprimand. At work, I tried to be efficient. I coughed up the right phrases in meetings and answered emails with the same calm tone I used in negotiations. There is a strange power in routine. It is both armor and anesthetic. My colleagues noticed I had stopped laughing at Myra's jokes in the same way. "Everything okay?" my manager, Jenna, asked once in the hallway. I nodded, muttered something about family, and then did not bring it up again. I felt like a woman with a cracked facade. From a distance, everything looked intact. Up close, you could see the fissures. 2 weeks after my birthday, our company announced a collaboration with a hospital network in upstate New York. It was a big deal. The project meant visibility, funding, and the chance to pilot a new outreach model that could help low-income patients better manage chronic conditions. I was assigned to be part of the team that would present the pilot to potential investors. The stakes felt simultaneously grand and raw. Here was a crack leading outward, where my skills could matter. We prepared for months. I crafted slide decks, rehearsed talking points, and spent late nights talking tech jargon into my phone until the words settled into a kind of second skin. We polished the narrative until it shone. A story of measurable impact, reduced readmission rates, better medication adherence. When our CEO, William Hargrave, announced that the team might be recognized at an upcoming industry awards gala, there was a tense thrill among us. William was the kind of leader who moved through a room and made it feel like a stage. He had a calm, resonant voice and an old-fashioned attention to credit. He remembered names and accomplishments in a way that made people lean forward. The night of the awards was an afterthought at first. I had hardly enough time to buy a dress, and I kept thinking about my father's letter like a dull, persistent hum. We were a modest team, 4 of us in the front row, nervous and trying to look formal among CEOs whose suits looked like they were tailored by memory. People posed for photos that would later be captioned with precise job titles. The city hall where the gala was held was all marble and soft lighting. A violinist played near the entrance. I felt oddly theatrical in a dress I didn't entirely recognize as mine. When it was my team's turn to be called up for a commendation, I felt my stomach flip like a stage light finding an unexpected actor. We walked up, made our brief remarks, and stepped down to applause that felt both earned and bewildering. The award was for Community Impact Innovation in Outreach. William's speech that night wandered in the generous way executive speeches do. A few jokes, a nod towards the work, and then, in a moment that did not entirely make sense to me at the time, he said, "Let's hear from Alina Rivera. Her persistence reminds me that the most important victories aren't the ones on paper." My heart stumbled. I had never heard him say my name with such warmth in a public setting. I stepped up to the mic because the current of attention made it awkward to refuse. I remember the hush like a weight. People leaned forward. My colleagues smiled at me like small flares of solidarity. I started with practiced sentences. I thanked my team. I spoke about patients we had helped. Then, as often happens when the microphone swallows you and the room narrows, I began to speak honestly, the way a confession leaks out when you think no one will judge you for the truth. I didn't expect to be here tonight, I said. Not because the work isn't meaningful, but because for the last month I've been dealing with something that made me question what support even looks like. There was a flutter, a whisper of curiosity. I had never in my life been comfortable making personal things public, but the room felt like a different kind of family, and the face of the woman who sat next to my mother, an image of composure, flashed in my head. I kept going. I received a letter from my father on my birthday. It said I was being cut off. It called itself Disownment Papers. I watched the faces in the crowd. Someone coughed. Someone leaned back. I imagined my father sitting at home and thinking I would be humiliated. Instead, what I felt was strangely steady, as if the air had cleared. I share this, I said, because part of the work we do is built on the idea that systems can help when the people who are supposed to support you cannot. If you're lucky, the world gives you more than one place to belong. There were people who would later tell me they had been surprised. There were others who found the moment moving. William, who had called my name in the first place, put his hand on my shoulder when I sat down, a small, decisive gesture, like someone anchoring not just a person, but the principle that vulnerability isn't weakness. After the event, strangers came to me to say the right things. Investors asked pointed questions about scalability and data. A reporter from a health magazine wanted to interview us about the pilot. The CEO's assistant approached, and with bureaucratic gentleness, asked if I would join William and a few board members for drinks after the event. It was a hopeful, dizzying mix of the professional and the painfully human. We went to a low-lit bar where business cards were traded like prayers. William and I talked about the project's next phase and about the fact that sometimes luck is less about chance and more about being present when opportunity arrives. He spoke of mentorship in a way that made it sound less like a title and more like a steady hand. At one point, he reached into his wallet and handed me a small card with his direct line. "If you ever want to talk about direction or resources," he said, "call me." I remember leaving that night with the card feeling like a talisman. But at the bottom of the good news, the letter in my kitchen table still existed, patient and merciless. The awards, the applause, they were an external confirmation that I had value, but they did not, by themselves, repair the rift at home. When I got home, the front door was locked. I stood on the porch for a long time, feeling oddly ashamed that I had expected an apology to be waiting. My mother's voice on the answering machine was short. My father's text said only, "We should talk." I swallowed and went to the neighborhood cafe the next morning because the city felt like a safer place than the house that held my childhood. Days blurred into weeks. William called once to congratulate us again and then, unexpectedly, to say he had circulated a memo proposing a new program fund. "I put your name forward," he said. "When someone opens a door, it's better to walk through together." That sentence, simple, decisive, became another quiet gravity. The turning point came not at the gala, but in a conversation that happened because of it. William invited me to a round table on corporate partnerships. There was a woman there, Dr. Layla Morno, who ran a foundation that provided micro-grants for people starting public health initiatives. At the end of the daytime session, she pulled me aside and said, "Your speech, I want to help. Not for publicity, for the work." It was the sort of offer you hear in stories and think, if only. But Layla was practical. She asked about budgets and timeframes. She asked, pointedly, about the most stubborn obstacles I faced. When I described the instability of funding and the absurd ways personal crises could derail pilot programs, she tapped her pen and said, "Funding won't fix a family problem, but it will make sure your work continues." And sometimes the fact that your work continues is what helps you figure out yourself. Over the next few months, with William and Layla in the wings, we scaled the pilot. We hired a project manager and secured a modest but reliable grant. The outreach program began to show results that were neat enough to fit into quarterly reports and messy enough to affect people's lives in ways graphs can't capture. We worked with community health workers who knew their neighborhoods like weather patterns. I visited clinics where a nurse remembered a patient's voice and a pharmacist made a joke that made everyone laugh. For the first time in years, my professional life had an axis I could point to and say, "This is mine." At home, the letters continued. My father, in his typical earnestness, sent a binder full of practical advice for living on a budget, tip sheets, coupon clippings, spreadsheets for real savings. It was an act that contained both care and ultimatum. My mother called more frequently, softer sometimes and other times more resolute. "We worry," she would say, like an echo of the earlier boundaries talk. "We worry because we love you." It took a while for me to understand that sentence as something complicated rather than simple. Parents worry because they love, but love is not always kind. There were confrontations that left small scars. I remember a Thanksgiving where the turkey was dry and people's eyes were dry as well. My father accused me of being ungrateful to a face I found myself unable to meet. I accused him of trying to control my decisions like a man stacking his chess pieces. Mateo, who had always found it hard to take sides, stood in the kitchen holding a dish towel and said, "Can we stop? This is killing us." I didn't realize, until later, how brave it was for him to name the rot like that. Slowly, the idea of disownment loosened. It wasn't an announcement that had the power to erase decades of connection. Papers are paper. What mattered was the way our lives continued to entangle. He would still show up when someone in the neighborhood was sick. He would still carry my mother's shopping bags down the porch steps as if practice made the load lighter. The letter became less like a verdict and more like a symptom, a family struggling to translate love into something that didn't feel like control. The real change came when I finally stopped waiting for them to reconcile on my timetable. I began to accept that forgiveness and understanding were not a single event, but a series of small, deliberate acts. I called my father less to argue and more to tell him about a meeting that had gone well. I stopped matching his coldness when he got pragmatic and instead told him, "I hear you," which was not the same as agreeing, but was a bridge of its own. One afternoon, months after the gala, my father fell ill. It was nothing dramatic at first, a cough that didn't quit. Then pneumonia. The hospital smelled like bleach and bureaucracy. I sat in a stiff chair outside the ward and called William, who had become more than a CEO to me. A patron of ideas and, unexpectedly, a man who seemed to understand that career and personal life could be messy in tandem. "Come by," he said simply. "We'll pick you up." For a CEO of a major company, William's presence at the hospital was oddly unpretentious. He introduced himself to the nurses with a quiet, authentic respect that smoothed the edges of procedure. He held a cup of coffee like someone who had memorized where the sugar packets lived. He sat with me through tests, talked about logistics, and then, in a gesture that I did not expect, told me a story about his own father, about a man who had been impossibly strict until an illness softened his voice. "People change when they have to," he said. "Sometimes it's the only language they learn." My father recovered. When he came home, he was quieter than before, as if illness had unhooked something in him that had relied on certainty as armor. The letter was still in the kitchen drawer, folded but not gone. I could have thrown it out then, surprised myself by doing so, but I didn't. Instead, one evening, my father sat across from me at the small kitchen table and pushed the envelope toward me like a peace offering that also admitted its failure. "I wrote it because I thought it would make you safer," he said quietly. "I thought it would make me safe." Those words surprised me into softness. I had imagined his motives as black and sharp. Instead, they were rusty and human. We talked. Not everything was resolved. We did not sweep our argument into a tidy drawer and lock it. But we started to learn a new grammar for coming back together. Fewer ultimatums, more conversation, and an understanding that support need not be a leash. In the months that followed, my work flourished in ways that felt both inevitable and baffling. The pilot became a model other cities wanted to replicate. I testified at a conference where people from state health departments took notes like sermons. Layla's foundation extended funding, and William recommended me for a fellowship that would fund a year of focused work. My calendar began to look like the kind of future I had once sketched in notebooks and then abandoned. I won't say the accolades filled the exact place the letter had tried to empty. They didn't, but they made something else possible, a life where my decisions were not invalidated by a single domestic signature. The recognition from industry leaders, the calls, the memos, the small nods in boardrooms acted like scaffolding. They didn't erase the ache of parental disagreement, but they made room for me to stand differently inside it. The story that began with a dinner table and a formal envelope didn't end with a dramatic reconciliation. Instead, it braided into a quieter truth. Families are complicated ecosystems, resilient not because they avoid harm, but because they learn to repair it. My father and I continued to disagree. We still had tense meals, but we also exchanged articles about budget planning. We traded recipes. We argued about politics, and then smiled at each other the next morning, because habit had a stubborn way of bringing people together. A year later, on the anniversary of the gala, my company invited me to speak about community partnerships. I thought of William, who had once called my name in a room full of strangers and rendered it visible. I thought of Layla and the nurses and the small victories that made a data point into a life improved. I thought of my parents, of the letter tucked away in a drawer like an artifact of a chapter we had not intended to write. When I speak now, I tell people two things: that resilience matters, and that community, the human, messy, professional, and personal networks we build, can be a lifeline when the ones we were born into stumble. I tell them that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is continue to show up for someone who once hurt you. So, what's the lesson? For me, it was not vindication by a CEO's praise, nor was it the erasure of the paper that had named me as an outsider. The lesson was more precise. Support should not be conditional in a way that makes people smaller. Families can demand conformity in the name of care, but real care recognizes autonomy. And communities, workplaces, mentors, colleagues, strangers who decide to listen can offer a second foundation to stand on. If there's one thing I want listeners to take with them, it's that life rarely offers clean conclusions. We live in the gray, in the tender spaces between grievance and forgiveness. You will be hurt by people you love. You will also find that your life, like a city block after a storm, can be rebuilt with different hands. You get to choose which hands you accept help from and how you pass that help to others. My father and I are still a work in progress. He calls more now, and sometimes I answer with impatience. He tries to be gentler, and sometimes he forgets in the way old habits do. But there are dinners now where the tension dissolves into laughter, small and imperfect. There are moments where he asks about my work with a genuine interest rather than a thinly veiled practicality. I have learned to accept help without reading it as submission, and to extend it without expecting the same in return. In the end, the envelope on my birthday was less a verdict and more a turning point. It forced the family to show its edges. It forced me to find a different kind of belonging, one built by people who saw me as more than a deviation from their plans. The CEO who called my name that night was not a miracle worker. He was a human who helped open a door. The real miracle, if there is one, was that on the other side of that door, I found the courage to keep building. Family should be about love, not control. And in the slow, stubborn way life allows, I finally learned that.